We have systems of state-subsidized private enterprise, which is, by its institutional nature, seeking to maximize profit and market share. And of course, it will therefore lead to consequences like these. So say, take your iPhone. The minerals, the crucial minerals may come from Eastern Congo, where multinationals are kind of waiting while the vicious militias murder people and give opportunities to get the minerals, and the whole history that I described before lies behind it. But the iPhone is actually manufactured in China. It's manufactured by a Taiwanese corporation, Foxconn, which runs assembly plants in China. Foxconn, in turn, is a subsidiary of Apple Corporation, the world's biggest corporation. If you look at the economics of iPhone production, turns out that the profits that Apple makes from the sale of an iPhone are about 10 times as high as the profits that Foxconn makes. And the profits that Foxconn makes are, I'm not sure what the figure is, but far higher than the profits that the assembly plant in China makes. So China is actually assembling the thing, and it's called a Chinese export, but China makes almost nothing from it. The Taiwanese corporation makes a lot more, and Apple makes a huge amount more. And that goes back to Apple stockholders, people like us and so on. Of course, highly concentrated among the extreme wealthy. But those are the economics of production of iPhones. Now, if you look further and ask where the technology from iPhones came from, most of it came from the taxpayer. In this case, mostly the US taxpayer. For example, the GPS system, it came from the Navy, US Navy. But who funds the US Navy? Well, American taxpayers. You look at the microelectronics, developed mostly through Pentagon funding. Who pays for that? Taxpayer. In fact, virtually all the technology comes from the dynamic state sector of the US, British, German economies in a system that amounts to public subsidy, private profit. So if we had a capitalist system, then the people who invested in the iPhone technology would make the profit from it. That's the way capitalism is supposed to work. You invest in something, you make a risky, costly investment. If someday it's profitable, you're supposed to get the profit. But that's not the way it works here. The taxpayer who paid for it in various indirect ways, gets no profit at all. The profit goes to the private enterprises that produce them, that are granted the technology, handed the technology, so they can tweak it for marketing and then sell it and make profit. So the profit goes to Apple and Microsoft and Bill Gates and so on and so forth, but the risky investments over decades often are made by the public. So it's a complicated system of state-supported private profit, which is built into the whole so-called globalization system. So if you take a close look at the trade treaties that are now being debated, transatlantic, trans-Pacific, these are called free trade treaties. But that's part of the general system of delusion imposed by our ideological institutions. They're not free trade treaties. They're investor rights treaties. They have almost nothing to do with free trade. Tariffs among the major traders are already very low. They'll barely change. A few cases here and there. They have the crucial element of them is what's called intellectual property. which is a nice term to cover monopoly pricing rights. So it grants pharmaceutical corporations, media, mega corporations, and others enormous rights to steal from the public through monopoly pricing, granted by the free trade systems. There are pretexts for this. They claim they need it for research and development, but if you look closely, that collapses pretty quickly. It's mainly a way to make the rich more powerful, more rich and more powerful. Another element is investor-state dispute settlements, which means the rights to corporations. Remember, corporations were granted the rights of personhood by the courts over a century of litigation, grants the rights of these immortal persons, state-created immortal persons, to sue other states, something that persons of flesh and blood can't do. Sue other states because they may take actions which might interfere with profits. So, for example, if Mexico wants to set up an environmental protection area where some U.S. corporation wants to mine gold, let's say, they can sue Mexico for taking away their profits, potential profits. You can't do that. I can't do that. But these persons can do it. That's the basis, goes on like this, for what are called free trade agreements. Just as the sale of iPhones is called free market enterprise. If you look closely, it's anything but. So going back to your question, the end result of the way these things are distributed is the nature of the institutions that in which we live and which we support, at least insofar as we tolerate them. After all, we have a right to change, and even the capacity to change them, but you got to understand them first.
So I've got a broader question, which is, with the current way that international society is organized and the spread of global capitalism, do you think we're really capable of dealing with the economic crisis, well, with all the crises that you've mentioned?
I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question. Global capitalism, state capitalism, is a pretty flexible system. It can have a lot of different variants. So the European social democratic welfare state innovations of the post-Second World War period changed the nature of state capitalism in significant ways. It's now being reversed. The intent and the nature of the austerity programs is basically one of dismantling democratic systems and welfare state arrangements. I think that's pretty good evidence for this. But it's a flexible system. And the question is it flexible enough to make it possible to deal with crises like, for example, the environmental crisis? If we had real market systems, we'd be finished. Market systems, in principle, cannot deal with the environmental crisis. They can only exacerbate it. And there's a reason for that, a simple reason. Market systems ignore what economists call externalities. So when there's a transaction between two units, say people or corporations or whatever, they look after their own interests, but they don't pay attention to the effects on others. That's an negative externality. And so, for example, when Goldman Sachs makes a transaction, if they're paying attention, they'll make sure that maybe a risky transaction, they'll make sure to cover their own risk if they're careful. But they're not going to pay attention to what's called systemic risk, the fact that if something goes wrong with this transaction, the whole system may collapse. That's an externality. Well, in that case, there's an answer. The taxpayer can step in and save them, which is what happens. But there's another externality which nobody can step in and save, and that's destruction of the environment. So to the extent that we have market systems we're basically dead. The question is, will the modifications of market systems that fall within the rough range of state capitalist systems, is that sufficient to deal with the problems of catastrophic climate change? Or must the whole system be dismantled and turned into a system concerned with use rather than profit? We don't know the answer to that question, but the answer will determine whether organized human life continues. And it's an urgent question. It's a question for this generation. It can't be put off.